Hi, I'm Ken Ivory. I'm the Executive Director of the Where's the Line America Foundation. You know, Ronald Reagan made a statement in 1985 that's more true today than it was when he made it. He said, "This is a wonderful time to be alive." We're lucky not to live in pale and timid times. We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something, for liberty and freedom and fairness, and these are things worth fighting for, worth devoting our lives to. So let us go forth with good cheer and stout hearts, happy warriors out to seize back a country and a world to freedom. Where's the Line America Foundation exists as the preeminent resource for teaching and learning where's the line, where the line was intended by our founding fathers between the roles of the federal and the state governments. Did you realize that from 1792 until 1930, the federal government spending was only 3% of GDP? Today it's nearly 26% of gross domestic product. How did we get there? Originally, the federal government was only supposed to operate under very limited delegated powers, and yet now it exercises power over virtually every aspect of Americans' daily lives. It's amassed a national debt exceeding $14 trillion, with unfunded obligations of nearly $100 trillion, and overspending by more than $1.5 trillion a year. Where's the line, America? You know, our founders established our unique system of government on some fundamental principles. Number one, they knew that it was the nature and disposition of men in government to amass unbridled power. They knew that our rights come from our Creator, not from a government or a court, and that government powers come from the people, not from a government or a court. Now, based on this first fundamental principle, that it's the nature and disposition of men in government to amass unbridled power, most of us learned in 8th grade civics some things about checks and balances, what we were taught as separation of powers. Most of us learned that these separation of powers, these checks and balances, only happen in Washington. We learned in 8th grade civics executive, legislative, and judicial. Among the three branches of power were the separation of powers and the checks and balances in government. Well, that's great as far as it goes, but that's not the whole story. Our founders designed a vast network of checks and balances, both internal and external checks and balances. Madison made the statement, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern, we would not need external and internal checks and balances." In the compound Republic of America, however, the power surrendered by the people was first divided among two distinct governments, and they control each other as a double security to the rights of the people. In fact, Alexander Hamilton was the big government guy of his day, and he made a similar statement. He said, "This balance of power between the state and the federal government is of the utmost importance, and we need to pay peculiar attention to it, because a certain rivalship will ever exist between the state and the federal government, and they will prevent each other from overpassing their constitutional limits." So while we so often look at the separation of powers as the checks and balances, in fact, the way our government was designed was this. It's a compound republic where the states created the external check to the federal government from getting out of control. Think about it this way. Our federal government is just doing what governments do. Our founders knew that it was the nature and disposition of government to amass unbridled power. It's like giving whiskey and car keys to 16-year-olds. You know what's going to happen. You can write the rest of that story. They knew that was the nature of government, and so that's why they had both internal separation of powers and external compound republic checks to the federal government from getting out of control. In fact, Madison went on to state that the powers delegated to the federal government were few and defined, and those reserved to the states were numerous and indefinite. And so, in fact, the structure of our unique system with its vast network of checks and balances looks more like this, where you have the balance of power preponderated, the balance of power weighing to the states, and the power delegated to the federal government being few and defined. Think about it. Our problems today are not left or right, liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat. It's the system. It's where to decide, not what to decide. If Washington is making the decisions about whether or not our teachers can have bake sales in schools, it doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat administration. It's going to be a stupid decision. Thomas Jefferson made the statement that we must strengthen the state governments. And we can't do this by any change in the Constitution, because it's the mere preservation of the Constitution is all that we need to contend for. It must be the states themselves erecting barriers at the constitutional line that cannot be surmounted. John Dickinson went further and made the statement that the government of each state is and is to be sovereign and supreme in all matters that relate to each state only, and subordinate barely in those matters that relate to the whole, and it will be their own faults if the several states suffer the federal sovereignty to interfere in the things of their respective jurisdictions. Imagine that. The system that they designed, the states were so important to this intricate network of checks and balances that John Dickinson and all of the founders said it will be the state's own fault if they allow the federal government to get out of control. So states are beginning to wake up to their responsibility to erect barriers at the constitutional line. Utah this past year passed House Bill 76, Federal Law Evaluation and Response. Under this law, Utah defines the constitutional line in statute and has a federalism subcommittee that reviews and evaluates and responds to all federal action that crosses that constitutional line. Under the Federal Law Evaluation and Response, Utah will call on other states to join with them in reviewing and evaluating and responding to federal legislation that crosses the constitutional line. Truly, the system is the solution, and the states are the sure guardians of our liberties. You're wondering, what can I do? Well, there are really 4 simple steps. The first step is to study and know where's the line. The second step is to share this with your friends, family, and neighbors to unleash that power of 10. The third step is to ask. Ask your representatives at every level of government if they know where's the line. And the fourth step is to commit. This takes all of us to commit time, talents, resources, and relationships to building a national, nonpartisan dialogue around this simple question: where's the line, America?